Thank you for being here today on this important occasion. I'm Duncan Hart of the Institute for Tolerance Studies, and on your seat you will find a booklet about the work that we do. And I want to thank Peter Zandan and Alonet Zarum who are supporters of the Institute, for underwriting this program, and I think Lance and Julia Bell for helping out, Gloria Abella Ballen for her assistance. We're remembering the Holocaust because we want to affirm that genocide cannot be repeated. As the saying goes, the person who forgets history is doomed to repeat it. We cannot forget the Holocaust. We must teach our children so that they do not forget. And we are here tonight to remember that tragedy and to stand against intolerance, racism, anti-Semitism in our own experience today, and not allow it to assume the terrible peak of genocide against any people. Many Jews did not leave Germany because they believed the Nazi hate speech was no more than political rhetoric. They were murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Birkenau, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, Chelmno, and Janek. Hate speech is not just rhetoric. Hate speech and intolerance are destructive to the social fabric of our society, as we saw with the Nazis. Belief has made important contributions to human spirituality and hope and moral focus, but it can also include the antithesis, the culture of absolutism and intolerance, when those who believe they have absolute truth can go to ominous lengths to guarantee it. Nazis believed the Jews were an inferior race, unworthy of life. This was state-sponsored genocide, the systematic murdering of people made undesirable by official policy. The terms genocide and Holocaust are often misused today to define other violent conflicts, but none of these were a Holocaust. None of these included the killing of 6 million people in 1,000 days and then burning the evidence. Part of the thing we'd like to do today is to honor the soldiers and the rescuers who helped people survive and to end the Holocaust. Like them, let us dedicate ourselves to consciously bend the arc of the universe toward justice. We're able to meet in this hall tonight because of an important state representative, Rena Zizipansky, a leader in our legislature. It's my pleasure to welcome her.
Thank you so much, Ron. As Ron said, I'm Rena Zizipansky. I'm the state representative for where we are gathered today, this area of Santa Fe. And I'm also the majority whip in the New Mexico House. I'm really glad to welcome you to the Roundhouse for this very solemn occasion and day of remembrance. This gathering in the Rotunda has been waylaid the last few years by the pandemic, but today we can be a community again, and I'm very grateful that we can gather this way. Today we honor the memory of 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust and millions of others in other communities, such as Roma communities, LGBTQ+ communities, people with disabilities, and so many others who were marginalized and brutally persecuted by the Nazis. We honor the memories of those who survived but are no longer with us today. And I know there are many here in New Mexico and here in our community in Santa Fe who trace their lineage or have many close relatives who were survivors and victims of the Holocaust. And today carries a significance for them that others cannot fully understand. But for all of us, of every faith and nationality, it's a day to look hard and look straight at the darkness that can exist in our world. Today we remember the atrocity of the Holocaust to try to understand what is unfathomable. But today we must also commit to the words that we must carry with us year-round. Never forget and never again. Now, there's plenty of room to disagree and compromise in civic life and in politics, I know that all too well, and I work really hard to model that civility that we need as a leader in our Democratic caucus and in the House. But when it comes to intolerance and bigotry, we have to be uncompromising in our opposition, without fail, wherever and whenever it rears its ugly head. And we have to be unwavering in our steadfast opposition to the rising tide of anti-Semitism, which I have researched and viewed with tremendous disappointment and sadness. But there are efforts across this country to demonize and oppress other communities as well. Most especially on the front lines are trans and queer communities today. But there's also scapegoating of immigrants and our neighbors with brown and black skin. So we have zero tolerance for the hateful Holocaust denialism that also persists. That stream of ignorance is tiring, but we cannot let ourselves be tired. This year, my colleagues Meredith Dixon and Pamela did introduced House Bill 111 that was to ensure the study of Holocaust and genocides would be included in world history courses in our schools. That bill did not make it to a vote this year, but I'm ready to work with our community and with all of you to help those representatives advance that bill in the next session and to talk with our public education department about ensuring that those courses are, those topics are required study for our social studies curriculum. So today we commit It's a small step, but it's an important step. And so that's my small part in committing to never forget, never again. And it's one reason why it's so important we hold this remembrance to get together again in our capital. As a mom, I know the hard work it takes to work every single day to build a loving community in Santa Fe and in our state. And we need to instill the values of love, acceptance, and tolerance in our next generation. And we have to speak with candor and with clarity about the darkest chapters in our human history, and that starts in our schools and in gatherings like this today. So I want to thank you, Dr. Hart, for inviting me today, and I look forward to working with you to make sure that our communities don't forget, and we make sure that this is never repeated. Thank you.
Here's a man who needs no introduction, or deserves no introduction. It's wonderful to see everybody. For those of you who actually don't know me, I'm Alonet, and I have the great honor of being the mayor of Santa Fe and a friend of Representative Sapansky, which is a big deal to be her friend, because she's a super talent in our state legislature. And I voted for you. It's good to be back together again. Thank you for convening us and giving us a chance to spend a little bit of time remembering and committing ourselves to the work that lies in front of us. As it is noted on the back of our program, April 19th is the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And in that spirit, today is not only Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's also Heroism Remembrance Day, and a recognition that we must take acts of heroism, small, individual, collective acts of caring, to stand up against anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry in all of its forms. We're witnessing a 36% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, the highest level since 1979, as people find it somehow acceptable to revisit the dark past and bring it into our present. Quick show of hands, how many of you were able to attend Skip Gates' program at the Lensic last week? You all? A few of us were there. It was a remarkable conversation. And at one point, Professor Gates said, you know, in America there are two rivers that flow beneath the floorboards of our country. One is racism against African Americans, and the other is anti-Semitism aimed at Jews. And whenever somebody wants to raise ugliness, stir division, create antagonism, divide us, they pry up those floorboards and take a dipper out of each of those rivers and sprinkle those waters of hate and anger and bias and bigotry in our country. And there's always somebody who will drink that water and take up from that ladle. And I think we see that happening now. I think we see that happening around the world. It's even in Santa Fe when we tell the truth about ourselves. This is a caring community. This is an accepting community. This is a loving community. It is a community that historically has reached out to people who are otherwise and in other places called other, whether they don't have legal documents or they are of a different home source, or they are practicing some other faith, or they are having a different skin color, or they are practicing a different sexual orientation or gender identity. Santa Fe has always been a place that accepts people. And yet we have those in our community who will seek to divide and to treat people poorly. And on that note, I am proud to tell you that I am one of 8 mayors in the United States who is working with the Harvard Graduate School of Design on a program called the Just City Initiative. The question asked is, what does it mean to be a just city? And if you stop and think about it, it's probably something I shouldn't have needed a course at Harvard to think about. But it's a great opportunity to hit the pause button and put all of our city values, programs, practices, resources in that frame. How are we practicing justice in Santa Fe? How are we tolerating injustice in Santa Fe? I'll be leaving in the morning for the last program in Boston, where we'll be making a presentation to the other mayors and to the faculty at the Graduate School of Design about our just values in Santa Fe, which are deep, historical, and profound, and areas where we come up short because we allow people to do without. We allow kids not to have the opportunities they need. We allow schools not to provide the education. We allow employers not to pay the living wage that people need to live here. And as a city, we don't always live up to our own aspirations. We're going to take being a just city as the frame for my tenure as mayor going forward. And we will be using our resources, our values, our budget, our legislative authority to pursue justice. And if I could poach on your territory, Rabbi, for 1 minute, we are taught, what doth the Lord require of thee? Only to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. That's something we in Santa Fe can do, will do, and we'll make sure that on this day of remembrance, we carry that work forward. Thank you, everybody.
It has not been even 80 years since the gas chambers. There are people alive who were children, who were even young adults, when Jews were being herded like cattle for mass slaughter across Europe. It started with conspiracy theories laced with anti-Semitism, and then it grew into individual acts of violence in tandem with state-sanctioned discrimination. Eventually, it became state-sanctioned mass murder. Never again, we cried. But what does that mean? Never again to the state-sanctioned mass murder of Jews? That should be obvious. That's easy. Never again should Jews be repeatedly targeted for violence. Never again should violent acts of speech against Jews be tolerated. Well, that's apparently very difficult. We have seen an explosion of anti-Semitism in this country, in New Mexico, and right here in Santa Fe. Particularly, we have experienced in the public schools. Not just swastikas in bathrooms, but Nazi salutes. Children telling their Jewish peers that they wish their families had been wiped out in the gas chambers. Children having swastikas literally drawn on them. Children being shown pictures of others. We have had to work with individual schools to help them learn how to address anti-Semitism properly, and we are working with the entire Santa Fe public school administration to help them do the same. But it's not just the schools. It's the swastikas in public places in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and beyond. It's the banner on an overpass on the I-25 in Albuquerque asking why Jews are banning free speech. It's the Zoom bombing of a New Mexico temple's prayer service with fascist and pornographic images. It's the beating up of a man in Albuquerque for wearing an item of clothing that identified him as Jewish. Are we headed towards state-sanctioned murder of Jews in this country? No, of course not. But are Jews facing more threats of violence today than in recent memory? Absolutely. And it's not just physical violence. It's open anti-Semitism and the passive tolerance of anti-Semitism. So it's the hijacking of the legislative process that would have made studying the Holocaust an essential part of education all across New Mexico. It's approving a statewide definition of anti-Semitism while refusing to meet to discuss how to actually combat the rise in anti-Semitism. It's faith leaders hosting speakers who compare Zionists to Nazis, or those who say that anti-Semitism only exists because of Israel or because Jews are being oversensitive. It's employers telling their employees that they hate Jews. It's Jews being banned from online spaces for expressing any pro-Israel views. Jews today face anti-Semitism in disturbing ways. The anti-Semitism of the far right is violent and immediate, while the anti-Semitism of the far left is pernicious and long-term. Never again should mean never again to all of this. It should mean that Jewish communities shouldn't even need security guards for services and events. It should mean that Jewish children feel safe at school. It should mean that Jews exist freely and safely at work, at home, and at prayer. And we are nowhere near to that point. And so, if Yom HaShoah is to mean anything, let it mean never again to any of those things. If Yom HaShoah is to mean anything, let it be the day when we commit to ending all of those pernicious things.
I'm Cantor Lianna Mendelsohn from Temple Beth Shalom, and I'm sharing a song today called My Chavert Mitzia, which means my childhood friend Mitzia, which was written by Bela Schechter Gottesman, who grew up in what is now southwestern Ukraine. And the song is in Yiddish.
En ich brech durch die Tierden von Mord und von Zeit, stehst du von mir vergabelter Weit, und von unser Tiertagen verlegte auf ihr, du schmeckst an ewigem Schmerz zu mir, mein
I want to thank you very much for organizing this event and for including me as a speaker today. I'm quite honored. Primo Levi was a scientist and a writer, and I think because of his science background, I have a special admiration for him. He was born on July 31st, 1919 in Torino, Italy. He was raised in a liberal Jewish family, but he was harassed for his Jewishness from early childhood. He received his degree in chemistry at the age of 21, and he worked professionally as a chemist until joining the Italian resistance. Levi and some comrades took to the foothills of the Alps and formed a partisan group. But being untrained for such a venture, he and his companions were arrested by the fascist militia 3 months later. First sent to Fiesole in Italy, he was then deported to Auschwitz in February of 1944, and he survived his 11 months there in large part because of his chemistry training and its use to the Nazis. After the war, he returned to his family home and he resumed work as a chemist. His first literary work was published in 1947 and describes his experience at Auschwitz with meticulous detail and scientific precision. He went on to write numerous books, short stories, essays, and poems, and is widely regarded today as one of the great Italian writers of the post-war period. His works have been translated into English in a 3-volume set, his collected works, and I'm only going to read a short poem of his, but I hope that it inspires you to go read some more of his writing. He died in 1987 from injuries sustained in a fall from his 3rd-story apartment landing. Whether or not his death was a suicide remains unclear. He had written quite a bit earlier that the period of imprisonment of survivors is the center of their life, the event that, for better or worse, has marked their entire existence. And in a book review, Gavin Jacobs tells us that Levy believed humans live in a state of tormented oscillation between conflicting moral drives, such as virtue and cruelty, truthfulness and deception, courage and cowardice. In conditions of extremity like a death camp, that oscillation is of course more radical, but it was also a state of being Levy recognized during his time as a partisan. And on this year, and as we heard, only a few days from now, the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, I selected a poem that Levy wrote called Partigia, which can be translated as partisan. Where are you, partisans of all the valleys? Tarzan, Curly, Sparrowhawk, Arrow, Ulysses? Many sleep in honored graves. Those still living are white-haired and tell their grandchildren how in that long-gone time of certainties they broke the German siege there where the chairlift rises. Some speculate in property. Others nibble at their government pensions or grow wrinkled at town meetings. Rise and stand, old men. For us there is no discharge. Let's meet again. Let's go back into the mountains, slow, out of breath, stiff-kneed, with many winters in our curving spines. The steep trail will be difficult for us, the cot, the bread. We'll stare without knowing each other, mistrustful, argumentative, and dour. Just as then, we'll be watching out so the enemy won't surprise us at dawn. What enemy? Everyone's enemy. Everyone's riven by his own frontier, the right hand the enemy of the left. Rise and stand, old men, your own worst enemies. Our war is never over.
Ani ma'amin, I believe the Messiah will still come. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, be'emunah shelema, HaMashiach, B'viat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin, Be'avam
I'm Rabbi Martin Levy here in Santa Fe. I think each of us holds unique memories, prayers, recollections about the Holocaust. I think of my father, Zichrono Livracha, Bernard Levy, who at age 29 in the spring of 1945 entered into the lager called Dachau. And with his army battalion, he helped liberate those who were still alive. So I can't even imagine what my dad went through in those days. But we have to remember, and so I would like to offer two excerpts from great writers. I want to segue from Rabbi Schlachter's thoughts on Primo Levi, who was also a poet and wrote one short book of poetry in the late 1940s before he began his career as a novelist. And this poem is called February 1946. I kept searching for you in the stars, and I questioned them as a child. I asked the mountains for you, but they gave me solitude and a brief peace only a few times. Because you weren't there in the long evenings, I considered it rash blasphemy that the world was God's error. Myself an error in the world. And when I was face to face with death, no, I shouted from every fiber. I hadn't finished yet. There was still much to do, because you were there before me, with me, beside you, just like today. Man, a woman under the sun, I came back because you were there. Dr. Edith Eger is 95 or 96 years old today. Not today, but presently. She's alive and well in San Diego, California. She's a practicing psychologist, a noted speaker, and has been for years throughout the United States. Edith Eger was 16 years old when her family were put on a train and sent to Auschwitz. Her parents were killed the first day, and a few hours later, she was marched before Joseph Mengele. He forced her to dance because he had heard she was a ballet dancer. He forced her to dance, and then he looked in the correct direction, which meant you shall live. She and her sister Magda survived Auschwitz. The way she was rescued, literally, she was pulled from a pile of corpses. She was lying in a pile with 20 or 30 dead people, and the army, the United States Army, soldiers came in, and they saw that there was a twitching in this pile. And they realized that maybe someone was still alive. And one of the soldiers went over and saw that this young woman, who was now 17 or 18 years old, was breathing. And they pulled her out of that pile and brought her back. So she came to America through many tribulations, learned English, became a practicing psychologist, and has been an inspiration to generations of people for the last 50 years. This is an excerpt from her book, The Choice. How easily a life can become a litany of guilt and regret, a song that keeps echoing with the same chorus. How easily the life we didn't live becomes the only life we prize. How easily we are seduced by the fantasy that we are in control, that we are ever in control, that the things we could or should have done or said have the power. If only we had done them and said them to cure pain, to erase suffering, to banish loss. How easily we can cling to worship the choices we think we could or should have made. Could I have saved my mother? Maybe. I will live for all the rest of my life with that possibility. And I can castigate myself for having made the wrong choice. That is my prerogative. However, I can accept that the more important choice is not the one I made when I was hungry and terrified, when we were surrounded by dogs and guns and uncertainty, when I was 16. It's the one I make now, the choice to accept myself as I am, human, imperfect, and the choice to be responsible for my own happiness, to forgive my flaws and reclaim my innocence. Thank you.
Thank you each one for your thoughts and what you have brought for us. And I would like to introduce Mr. Scott Levin, who is the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League for the Mountain States area. He is Phi Beta Kappa from George Washington University, University of Denver Law, ADO board member, recipient of the 2010 Torch of Liberty Award. Thank you for your work on civil rights and the litigation against bias and bigotry, which is so much needed at this time.
Thank you so much. In just about an hour, the sun is going to go down. We'll be treated to a beautiful New Mexico sunset. The beautiful red, orange, and blue sky will give way to a brilliant night sky, if we're lucky. It's said that you can see about 6,000 stars with your naked eye. And I don't know about you, but on nights when the clouds are out and we can't see the shimmering twinkle of the stars, I feel a bit gloomy. Yet I'm at peace because I know that eventually the clouds will part and I'll see the brilliant sky again as the light shine down upon me. But think about the darkness that would flood our lives if we were no longer able to see those stars overhead. It's hard to imagine their light being forever extinguished. 6,000 stars, 6 million humans. In what to history will be the blink of an eye, 6,258,673 lives were extinguished in the Holocaust. There were mothers, fathers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and 1.5 million of them were children. None of them will ever have their light shine again. And these are not just lives lost. In addition, there are paintings that will never be painted. There are books that will never be written. There is music that will never be heard. But there were also hands that will never be held, hugs never received, kisses never exchanged, and generations never born. My name is Scott Levin, and I'm the director of the Mountain States region of the Anti-Defamation League, and it's truly a privilege to be here. I want to thank Duncan Hart and the Tolerance Studies, Institute for Tolerance Studies for extending the invitation to me, as well as the many community supporters of this event. And a special thank you to Peter Zandan and to Alonet Zarum, who've generously underwritten tonight's event. And I also want to recognize my friend and ADL board member, Julia Linderbell, who's here tonight as well. Thank you. Now, it's fitting and proper that we come here to the Roundhouse to memorialize the victims of the Holocaust, to honor Holocaust survivors, and to pass on the lessons we've learned. Because it was the governments of many countries that perpetrated the Holocaust. As a result, it's especially gratifying to be here in the New Mexico capital, the center of the government for this state, and in the presence of the representative and the mayor and other elected officials. Now, we often think about the Holocaust at its height, when the Nazis adopted the final solution to the Jewish question, The final solution, of course, was the deliberate and systemic mass execution, mass murder of European Jews. The Nazis wanted to kill all Jews in the Nazi-controlled lands. The final solution was the official policy of the Nazis, adopted in January of 1942, and it created a mass genocide on a scale not previously seen, at least not in the modern era. The Nazis and their allies killed 2/3 of all Jews in Europe. That was 1/3 of all Jews in the entire world wiped out in this final solution. And to do so, they utilized the best architects and engineers they could to improve their efficiency. You see, they started out with simply lining up the Jews on the edge of ravines that often they dug themselves and just shooting them. And they fell where they died. But the architects and engineers used their skills to design what they called showers, but we know they weren't. It's where they dropped the Zyklon B pellets that were dropped to cause excruciating death. And then they built the crematoria to burn the evidence at such high heat that it not only burned the flesh away from the bones, but the bones themselves. It was simply horrific. But I ask you to think back just a little bit further. What happened in those years before the final solution became the official policy of the Nazis? Under the rule of Adolf Hitler, the persecution and segregation of Jews was implemented in stages, eventually allowing neighbors to not care about the Jews whose ashes would soon blow down upon them. The Nazis began with state-sponsored racism that led to anti-Jewish legislation, economic boycotts, and as we know, much worse. For me, the pivotal turning point was the violence that broke out on the night of November 9 into the morning of November 10, 1938. It came to be known as Kristallnacht. The night of broken glass was so named because of the shattered glass that littered the streets after the vandalism and destruction of Jewish-owned businesses, homes, and synagogues. That night into the morning, brown-shirted paramilitary thugs and Hitler youth units attacked Jews and Jewish institutions. 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and taken to concentration camps, having been arrested simply because they were Jews without any further cause for arrest. And in the immediate aftermath of Kristallnacht, the German government just waited to see what the world would do. It was not as if Kristallnacht was hidden from the world. American newspapers across the country covered the Nazi assault on the Jews. On their front pages, banner headlines, including one that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that perhaps, like none other, so aptly summarized the danger for the Jews under the Nazi regime. On the front page of the Los Angeles Examiner on November 23, 1938, it read, "Nazis warn world, Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies." This is only 5 years before the final solution became the policy of the land. Yet at President Roosevelt's press conference a week after Kristallnacht, when he said that he could scarcely believe that such things could occur in a 20th century civilization, when he was asked by a reporter if he would recommend relaxing the restrictions on immigration to admit the Jewish refugees from Europe, he said, "That's not in contemplation. We have a quota system." So the relatively benign response to this just terrible thuggery of Kristallnacht only served to embolden the Nazis in their attacks on Jews. And it reminds me of the wise words of Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate, who wrote, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference." Now, there were many people that absolutely hated the Jews at that time. But for those not imbued with Jewish hatred in America as much as in Germany, they were simply indifferent to the plight of the Jews. Today we ask those in positions of power and our allies to stand up to the indifference from which Jews still suffer. But the challenge that we face today is that many believe Jews simply don't count in the ways of other targeted communities. After all, they believe that Jews perceived to be white and with some measure of affluence and influence can't face the same hardships do other targeted communities. We certainly do not want to enter into an oppression Olympics. But I stand before you as a Jew to say that none of this really makes sense. As a Jew, we count too. I don't want to take away from anyone else. I just want people to remember that Jews also count. And so, to our so-called whiteness, it's important for us to note that 17% of American Jews today identify as Jews of color. There are Latino, Black, Asian, and nearly every other type of peoples in the country who also happen to be Jewish. And in our Jewish ancestral land of Israel, it surprises most people to learn that about 50% of the people, of the Jews that live in Israel, are Mizrahi Jews, descended from Jews in the Middle East and Central Asia, from the Babylonian and Persian heritage, who look and act and are just as Arabic as their neighbors. They don't look and act, and as I do, present as a white Ashkenazi Jew whose ancestors come from Eastern Europe. But more to the point today, we find that to the extremes on the right, Jews are not white or not white enough, and to the extremes on the left, Jews are too white. There's also a belief that without the perceived economic hardships as other targeted groups have, Jews cannot suffer in the same ways as these other groups. And it's true that unlike my father and his father who immigrated to this country with no money, no privilege, no influence, there are laws that now protect me. So unlike them, I was not barred from attending colleges I was qualified to enter as they were. I was not kept by restricted covenants from living in a neighborhood that I could afford as they were. I was not barred from getting a job for which I had the skills as they were, all simply because they were Jews. And yes, despite the fact that Jews make up a little more than 2% of the country's population, we do punch above our weight. 6% of the people in Congress are Jewish, a little bit more than the 2% of the rest of us. And of the 115 Supreme Court justices in U.S. history, all but 7 have been white men, with 8 of them being Jewish over the entire history of this country. So people think that Jews must live in relative comfort. What are they complaining about? I only ask you to think about another time in recent history when Jews were members of the legislature, were judges, were professors, were lawyers, were bankers, were ensconced in society. How about pre-Holocaust Germany and how things changed so quickly there? You see, for Jews, though we don't look at the relative safety and security of the past 50 years in the United States, but we measure it in millennia. We know that there have been relative times of safety and security, but they're always punctuated by attempts to extinguish us. This should be apparent to the people here in New Mexico, because we know that there were Jews that fled the Inquisition and made their way here. And their descendants are just now beginning to become aware of some of that and being able to reclaim some of that heritage. Even today, when we are in what seems to be relatively safe and secure times, the signs demonstrate quite the opposite. As was noted, according to recent studies, the increase in anti-Semitic incidents, 36% just from 2021 to 2022. And according to a recent ADL study, 85% of Americans believe at least one anti-Jewish trope, things like Jews have too much control, too much power, or too greedy. And that compares to 61% just a couple years before. It is going up. Today, 20% of Americans believe at least the majority of tropes that we put in front of them. 20%. But just a few years ago, that was 11%. And of those 3,697 anti-Semitic incidents throughout the United States that we measured last year, here in New Mexico, as the rabbi pointed out, Rabbi Amswych pointed out, there are real things happening on the ground. There is the anti-Semitism in school. There's the ancient petroglyphs in town, vandalized with the swastika and ethnic slurs. A synagogue receiving a suspicious package with protruding wires. A letter containing anti-Semitic symbols and an unknown substance sent to a Jewish advocacy group. A mezuzah with its holy scroll inside, vandalized on someone's front porch. On top of that, there have been nearly 24 white supremacist literature drops across New Mexico just last year. We have to recognize that according to the FBI hate crime statistics, over the past few years, anti-Semitic hate crimes across the country account for 60% of all religious-based crimes. Today in America, everyone has to be concerned about security. Certainly with shootings at schools, movie theaters, churches like the Mother Emanuel Church down in South Carolina, every government building, public place where people gather, and faith-based institution needs to be worried about security. But nowhere more so than every synagogue in America. Following the 11 innocent souls killed at the Tree of Life synagogue, I can guarantee that every synagogue has a security plan, and most feel the need to have police or security when Jews gather. It's not surprising that according to our recent surveys, Jews are feeling less safe and secure in the United States than they have in a long, long time, despite whatever influence and affluence we may have. And these numbers have gone up over the past decade. As our leaders have used ugly comments to describe Jews, immigrants, women, people of color, the LGBTQ+, so too have people become emboldened to express their own ugly thoughts and to act on them. Now, over the past several years, I've spent a lot of time trying to persuade people that we aren't in pre-Holocaust times. There are major, major differences. I've encountered people who have abused the Holocaust on both sides of the political spectrum. On one side, there are those that compare their plight to what Jews went through during the Holocaust. You know, the people that put on a yellow star so they can express their displeasure at having to wear masks or to stay 6 feet apart from others during the height of COVID, as if it was as bad as the Jews who were forced to wear yellow stars to ensure they were denied their rights and eventually rounded up and taken to concentration camps. And on the other side, there are those that feel the need to compare leaders they don't agree with or don't like to Adolf Hitler. They also forget that the Holocaust involved government actually acting. But I have to tell you, I'm now a bit more concerned than ever. It's getting harder to distinguish the Nazi thugs that made up the brown shirts on Kristallnacht, the ones who answered the call of their leaders to attack the Jewish homes and synagogues and businesses. It's hard to distinguish those people with the Proud Boys who answered the calls of their leaders and stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. It's even harder when Jew hatred is normalized, when we have celebrities like Ye, formerly Kanye West, who announces in the middle of the night that he's going to go DEFCON 3 on the Jews. And he's defended, or his actions are excused by so many. And it is that much harder when everyday comments of Jew hatred have real-world consequences, as the numbers demonstrate. Again, Jews only make up little more than 2% of this country's population. We cannot do it alone. It will truly take a whole-of-society approach to make things better. Holocaust education as a requirement of graduation is a big part of it, and I hope it comes back. But so is universal condemnation when anti-Semitic harassment, vandalism, and assaults take place. We live in a country that values its First Amendment rights, but just because someone has a free speech right to say the most ugly, vile things, it doesn't mean that you should not use your own free speech right to counter that filth, whether you're an elected official or you're just a neighbor. I work at the Anti-Defamation League, an organization whose mission has been the same since 1913. Throughout that entire time, our mission has been to not only fight anti-Semitism, but also to secure justice and fair treatment to all. We know that it takes all of us working together in order to defeat anti-Semitism, racism, and the other forms of hatred. To me, personally, it's the embodiment of those three just important questions that were posed by Hillel in the Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our Father. Hillel asked, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? It's important that we stand up for ourselves. But he also asked, if I am only for myself, what am I? I need to act on behalf of other people. And then he asked, perhaps one of the most important of the questions, if not now, when? Like Martin Luther King many years later would recognize, it is the urgency of now. So please join us as we try to make this world a better place. We need to kurban. We need to repair this world. Lives were just needlessly lost during the Holocaust, and lives remain at risk today. So don't be indifferent. Stand up for yourself. Stand up for others. Keep the night sky and the future bright.
Vous ne me faites pas peur. J'ai survécu à bien pire que vous. You don't scare me. I survived much worse than you. These words were spoken by Simone Weil in 1979 to far-right extremists who had infiltrated one of her political meetings. Simone Weil, spelled with a V, not a W. It's an important difference. If you Google it, you'll understand why. Simone Weil was born Simone Jacob in Nice, France, in 1927. In March 1944, along with her mother Yvonne and her sister Madeleine Milou, she was deported to Auschwitz, then Bergen-Belsen. Her father André and her brother Jean were deported separately, as was her sister Denise. Only Milou, Denise, and Simone survived and returned to Paris. Simone's contributions and her accomplishments are many. Too many, perhaps, to name here, but I will try and honor them by saying that she truly and profoundly affected and changed French society, uplifting it in the best possible way. There are many of her quotes that I could have chosen this evening, but the one I open with is the one from which I draw the most inspiration. One of the most meaningful observances of Yom HaShoah that exists in our modern world is the French tradition of reading the names of the 76,000 Jews who were deported from France. This reading takes 24 hours over 3 years, convoy after convoy, name after name, or an age, or a place of birth if the name is not known. At one such reading, Simone Weil stood and read her own name and that of her sister and mother who were deported along with her. She stood before us, dignified, calm, powerful, just as years before she had answered those thoughts. Her simple presence, her standing in front of us, was quite the sight. A survivor of the horror and not a victim of it. Later that night, as the crowd grew smaller, as the reading of the names went on, a gentleman came up with 3 other people and interrupted my reading of the list of names. He read names of his family members and then read his own. And looking up, standing straight, firmly added, "I came back," and pointed out to the 3 generations who stood beside him, a child, a grandchild, and a great-grandchild. "You don't scare me. I have survived much worse than you," stands out as a rallying call to action. That we may remember that we stand on the shoulders of giants whose strength resides in their ability to belittle and undermine hatred, racism, and bigotry, refusing to give it the space its supporters would wish it to hold. As we gather to remember all those murdered in the Shoah, all those whose lives and families were forever changed, we also look ahead to how we can best honor the memory of so many. And we apply the lessons that we can learn from their lives. We draw inspiration from their resilience, their courage, and their faith, as we too commit to never again, that such atrocities should never be perpetrated against any individual or any group of people. Anna Senesh wrote, "There are stars up above, so far away we can only see their light long after the star itself is gone. May the light of so many stars be a blessing and a source of comfort to us as we honor their memories and their legacies."
Good evening. I am Camilla Mandler, and I am the only child of Erica and George Mandler, who were Holocaust survivors. My mother was born in Vienna, and my father in Marish, Ostrau, Czechoslovakia. They met in and escaped from Novaki, the camp located in central Slovakia. Once in America in 1949, my father, a physician, encountered open and aggressive anti-Semitism when applying for a position in a Pennsylvania hospital. "We don't hire Jews," they said when hearing his accent and asking a few questions. Plunged into depression, he asked my mother, "Why did we survive?" Finally, in 1951, they landed in a small farming community in what's referred to as the Bible Belt, northwest Missouri. No other Europeans, no Jews. Cows, cornfields, and my parents, I always said. The town and the entire area desperately needed an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist, so everyone embraced my parents. They were curious, interested, almost with a naive fascination. Who were these very different people who spoke with an accent? When I was born in 1954, in order to give me a Jewish education, my parents drove 150 miles round trip each week to the nearest synagogue for religious school. This is also where we went for services and holidays. Though my father was closed to talking about anything to do with the war, my mother, determined to respond to people's curiosity, began talking about Judaism. She packed up the menorah, Shabbos candles, the Kiddush cup, and a piece of carefully saved matzah and began speaking to schools and various other organizations. The townspeople were very receptive. They were getting to know Erica and George, real people in their midst. Did they connect them to the Jews? Today, I ask many questions that I was too young to ask then. What my mother was already doing in the 1960s was giving voice, educating, laying the groundwork for her journey. My father passed away in 1994, coinciding with Steven Spielberg's initiating of the HaShoah project, in which testimonies were gathered from survivors from all over the world. My mother was one of them. This was the experience that released her, and from that moment she began speaking and never stopped. Until she passed away in 2010 at 88, she spoke to thousands of students and all variety of organizations throughout Missouri, Iowa, and Arkansas. There were many amazing moments along the way, but the most extraordinary is that the students in our town's high school produced a play based on my parents' story called Courage and Love, the George and Erica Mandler story, first in 2008, and then again just this past November. I tell this because it's critical to my message. In this small, traditionally Christian farming community, there is still not one single Jew. Many of these people will never meet another Jew, but they knew my parents, especially my mother. They heard her story from her mouth. They knew Erica Mandler. They know the Holocaust did indeed happen. They will never again think of the Jews as some amorphous, threatening group because they knew Erica Mandler. And that is exactly what we must do. We must give Judaism a face. My mother said in every one of her talks, you must always speak out against any injustice that you witness. You must never be afraid to speak out. You must never stay silent. The horror that happened once must never happen again. Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, the UN envoy to monitor anti-Semitism, said in a recent interview, the government can't fight hate alone. It is up to ordinary people to speak up, to speak out, whenever they encounter anti-Semitism. We can't let even the smallest comment pass without them being challenged. As a child of survivors, I feel a particular responsibility. I am part of the last generation who has grown up hearing the stories my mother and father told me of what they witnessed during the Holocaust. I believe it is my responsibility, as well as all of ours, to speak up, to speak out, to never allow any injustice or comment to slip by unaddressed. All of our futures are at stake. Our Jewish future depends on us. We're not able to light the memorial candles because of the fire alarms. So let us honor the 6 million with these empty chairs in silence.
My name is Hazzan Jonathan Angress. I am the spiritual leader of the Congregation of Bnei Israel in Albuquerque. This setting of the Al Malei Rachamim prayer, the memorial prayer for the 6 million, was composed by one of my colleagues and teachers, Hazzan Faith Science Center, utilizing motifs and the traditional chant mode and chazanut cantorial art style. I invite everyone to please rise. Bitzlor hachayim et nishmata Adonai hu nachalata v'yanuchu b'shalom al mishkava I'd like to invite the rest of my colleagues to please join me as we all collectively recite the mourner's song. Yitkadosh Shemei Rabbah El Malakim Ra Kirutei V'Alit Malkutei B'chayechon V'Yumechon U'B'chayei V'Kol Beit Yisrael Ha'agalah B'Zman Kariv V'Imru Amen Yehei Shemei Rabbah V'Barach Le'olam V'Lamed Amraya Yitbarach V'Yishkabach V'Yitahar V'Yitramach V'Yitkaseh V'Yitadar, V'Yitalel, V'Yitalal, Shemei V'Zashah, V'Rivu, Le'ela, V'Yinkol, V'Yirchata, V'Shirata, Tushmechata, V'Nechamata, Da'amiran, V'Chama, V'Yimru, Amen. Yehei Shalom, Ha'rak, V'Yishmael, V'Chayim, V'Neim, V'Chol Yisrael, V'Yimru, Amen. Oseh Shalom, V'Yimru, Gloria Abella Ballen. Aleinu v'Kol Yisrael, Amen.
I'd like to thank each everyone who has participated and made this such a special event today. Thank you for being here.
It's amazing. Like, and I never experienced that. I went to a wedding back in that day. Yarmulkes. Nobody had yarmulkes. That was embarrassing. But, yeah.